September 12, 1942. Charters Towers Airfield, Queensland, Australia. The corrugated tin roof of the makeshift hangar radiates heat like a furnace as 43-year-old Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn drives the final mounting bolt through a sheet of aluminum scavenged from a wrecked P-39 Airacobra. His hands, black with grease and scarred from 1,000 repairs, don't shake despite the fact that in 6 hours, his modifications will either revolutionize aerial warfare in the Pacific or kill the crew testing them over Buna. He wipes sweat from his eyes and steps back to examine his work. 4 additional 50-caliber machine guns now bristle from the nose of the Douglas A-20 Havoc, where a bombardier's greenhouse once stood. The aircraft looks wrong, unbalanced, almost crude, like a bird of prey that grew extra talons overnight. Outside, the heat shimmers in waves off the tarmac at 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The bomber's engines tick as they cool, somewhere 1,700 miles north. Pappy's wife Polly and their 4 children wake to another morning imprisoned at Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, unaware that their husband and father is transforming American bombers into instruments of vengeance. The conventional wisdom says medium bombers belong at altitude, 12,000 feet or maybe 15,000, where they can drop their ordnance with relative safety and let gravity do the work. The Air Corps manual for the B-25 Mitchell, sitting dog-eared on Pappy's workbench, dedicates exactly 0 pages to low-level strafing operations. The aircraft's forward-firing armament, a single 30-caliber machine gun operated by the bombardier, was designed to ward off frontal fighter attacks, not to suppress anti-aircraft fire or tear through ship hulls at masthead height. But last week, Pappy watched from his P-40 cockpit as a Japanese convoy of 16 transport ships sailed unmolested through the Bismarck Sea, bound for Leh with reinforcements and supplies. American bombers circled overhead like impotent hawks, dropping bombs from altitude that churned up white geysers of water but left the ships intact. The transport's anti-aircraft crews sent up walls of flak that forced the bombers higher, wider, safer, and utterly ineffective. By the time the convoy reached Port Wayne, it had suffered exactly 2 hits. 14,000 Japanese soldiers disembarked to kill more Americans. Pappy had screamed into his radio, his Arkansas drawl cracking with rage. "We need to get down on the goddamn deck and shoot the sons of bitches." But with what? A bombardier squinting through a Norden bomb sight, a single rifle-caliber machine gun. The problem wasn't courage. American pilots had that in abundance. The problem was that medium bombers, the workhorses of the Pacific Air War, had been designed for a war that no longer existed. What Pappy Gunn knows, what keeps him working through the tropical heat, ignoring the malaria chills that rack his body every 3rd day, is that he can transform these bombers into something the Japanese have never encountered. What he doesn't know yet is that his improvised gun packages will become the blueprint for the most devastating close-air support weapon of World War II, that his modifications will sink more than 200,000 tons of Japanese shipping, or that the technique he's pioneering in this sweltering tin shed will evolve into tactics used by AC-130 gunships 6 decades later. He only knows that conventional bombing against Japanese convoys has a hit rate of less than 2%. He knows that it takes an average of 108 bombs dropped from altitude to sink a single transport ship. He knows that while Allied bombers circle safely overhead, achieving nothing, his family remains captive, and Japanese reinforcements continue to flow south unimpeded. And he knows that in 6 hours, a crew of young men will climb into this modified A-20, dive to 50 feet above the water, and discover whether a blacksmith's son from Arkansas has just reinvented aerial warfare or built them a flying coffin. The invasion of Buna waits for no one. The war that holds Pappy's family hostage doesn't pause for innovation. And somewhere in the Pacific darkness, Japanese convoys are already preparing to sail, completely unaware that the rules of engagement are about to change forever. The North American B-25 Mitchell bomber was never supposed to be a gunship. When it rolled off the production line at the North American Aviation Plant in Inglewood, California in 1941, it was designed as a medium bomber, a workhorse aircraft meant to deliver substantial bomb loads economically and accurately from moderate altitudes between 8,000 and 12,000 feet. twin Wright R2600 engines, 64 feet from nose to tail, 95-foot wingspan, loaded weight of 33,000 pounds, maximum speed of 230 mph, range of 300 miles. The Mitchell was a solid, reliable aircraft named after Brigadier General William "Billy" Mitchell, the charismatic air power prophet who proved in 1921 that planes could sink battleships. It carried a crew of 6, pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and 2 gunners. Its defensive armament included a tail gun, a dorsal turret, and a ventral gun tray that took almost a minute to extend, by which time a Zero fighter could make 3 attack passes. The waist guns posed as much danger to the Mitchell's own vertical tails and engine nacelles as they did to enemy fighters. The aircraft was thoroughly conventional, thoroughly tested, and thoroughly inadequate for the kind of war being fought in the Southwest Pacific in 1942. In the jungles and islands of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, altitude was a luxury American bomber crews could rarely afford. The jungle environment reduced the usefulness of medium-level bombing. Flying at 10,000 feet, a bombardier might spot a ship, an airfield or a supply dump, but actually hitting it through the dense canopy in the face of anti-aircraft fire while being harassed by Zeros was another matter entirely. Bombs dropped from altitude scattered. Many disappeared into the jungle without detonating. Others landed harmlessly in water. The few that found targets often caused minimal damage because they lacked the precision to strike vulnerable points. Meanwhile, Japanese supply convoys were running nightly, sustaining isolated garrisons, reinforcing threatened positions, and delivering troops and equipment throughout their sprawling Pacific empire. American submarines were taking a toll, but submarines couldn't be everywhere. The US Army Air Forces needed a way to hammer these convoys from the air, to deny the Japanese the freedom of movement that geography seemed to grant them. They needed aircraft that could fly low, loiter over targets, suppress defensive fire, and deliver devastating attacks against ships and shore installations. The problem was that no such aircraft existed in the American inventory in mid-1942. Fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and P-39 Airacobra had the speed and maneuverability for low-level attacks, but they lacked the range, the punch, and the survivability to sustain operations against well-defended targets. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress were designed for high-altitude strategic bombing, not low-level ship-busting. Light bombers like the Douglas A-20 Havoc showed promise, but they were in short supply. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber was available in increasing numbers, but it was designed for a completely different mission profile. What the 5th Air Force needed was an aircraft that combined the range and payload of a medium bomber with the forward-firing punch of a fighter. They needed something that could approach targets at wave-top height, suppress anti-aircraft fire with streams of heavy machine gun fire, say, and then either strafe the target to pieces or skip bomb it with 500-pound bombs released so low they bounced across the water like stones before slamming into ship hulls below the waterline. They needed a gunship, and they needed it in weeks, not months, not years, because every week of delay meant more Japanese supply runs, more reinforced positions, or dead American and Australian soldiers on jungle battlefields where air support meant the difference between survival and annihilation. Enter Major General George C. Kenney, who arrived in Australia in August 1942 to take command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific Theatre. Kenney was 53 years old, a veteran of the First World War, and a man with no patience for orthodoxy when orthodoxy was getting his men killed. He immediately began touring his scattered bases, looking for solutions to the tactical problems that were bleeding his bomber force white. At Charters Towers Airfield, south of Townsville in Queensland, he found something interesting. A grease-smeared former Navy pilot in his early 40s working in a shelter on a Douglas A-20 Havoc, converting it from a light bomber into something else entirely. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn, so called by everyone who knew him because at 43 he was ancient by Air Force standards, was unlike any officer Kenney had ever met. Gunn had enlisted in the Navy in 1918, served 21 years as an aviation mechanic and then a naval aviation pilot, and retired in December 1939 as a chief petty officer. He was an expert in low-level flying, a gifted aircraft mechanic, and a man who understood airplanes the way a blacksmith understands iron, because he could shape them with his hands. After leaving the Navy, Gunn moved his family to the Philippines, where he helped start Philippine Airlines, flying 5 privately owned Beechcraft aircraft on cargo and passenger routes throughout the islands. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Gunn was in Manila. Major General Louis Brereton, commander of the Far East Air Force, immediately commandeered Philippine Airlines aircraft and personnel. Gunn was sworn into the Army Air Forces as a captain, given command of a makeshift air transport squadron, and ordered to evacuate military personnel from Japanese-held territory. For the next 6 weeks, Gunn flew mission after mission into hostile airspace in unarmored Beechcraft planes, bringing out pilots, flying supplies to besieged troops on Bataan, and performing feats of low-level flying that earned him a reputation as either the bravest or the craziest pilot in the Philippines. He survived being shot down once, crashing into a coconut plantation and being rescued by the plantation owner, someone he'd flown as a passenger during peacetime. Eventually, in late January 1942, Gunn flew one of the last aircraft out of the Philippines to Australia, carrying key personnel to safety. But he left something behind. His wife, Clara Louise, and their 4 children, Nathaniel, Connie, Julie, and Paul Jr., were trapped in Manila when the city fell. On January 20, 1942, the Japanese rounded up American and Allied civilians and interned them at the University of Stowe. Thomas Pappy Gunn's family would remain prisoners there for 3 years, living on starvation rations, subject to brutal discipline, slowly wasting away while he fought from Australia, unable to reach them, unable to protect them, able only to kill as many Japanese as possible in the desperate hope that ending the war faster might save their lives. This was the man General Kenny found working on an A-20 in a tin shelter at Charters Towers in August 1942. This was the man who, when asked what he was doing, explained that he was installing 4 50-caliber machine guns into the bombardier's nose, replacing the transparent plexiglass with solid metal, and transforming the light bomber into a low-level strafer that could suppress anti-aircraft fire and tear enemy aircraft and installations to pieces. Kenny asked where Gunn had gotten the machine guns. Gunn explained that he was scavenging them from wrecked fighters scattered across Australian airfields, P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Airacobras, damaged beyond repair, but with functional weapons. The 5th Air Force supply of 50-caliber machine guns was severely limited throughout the Southwest Pacific. There were never enough. So Gunn did what any good mechanic does. He improvised, he found wrecks, he salvaged guns, he fabricated mounts, he tested, adjusted, tested again. He made it work because making it work was the only option. General Kenny was impressed. This old sailor understood something that headquarters staff in comfortable offices never would, that war is not won by following procedures but by solving problems, and that the best solutions often come from people who know their tools intimately enough to bend them to new purposes. Kenny immediately placed Gunn on his personal staff as Special Projects Officer and gave him a simple mandate: convert more aircraft, make them deadlier, do it fast. Gunn set to work with a fury that astonished everyone around him. He wasn't just an engineer solving a technical problem, he was a father trying to save his family by shortening a war. Every aircraft he modified, every sortie that aircraft flew, every Japanese ship sunk or airfield destroyed brought the war closer to Manila, closer to Stowe, Thomas, closer to his wife and children. Fury is a powerful motivator. Desperation is an even more powerful engineer. By early September 1942, Gunn had converted several A-20s into strafers. The modifications were crude but effective. 4 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the nose, solid metal panels replacing the bombardier's transparent station, additional ammunition storage, bomb racks modified to carry parachute fragmentation bombs, small bombs slowed by parachutes, so the attacking aircraft could escape the blast radius even at ultra-low altitude. The parafrag bombs would float gently down over enemy airfields and installations, exploding above parked aircraft and fuel dumps, showering them with red-hot fragments and white phosphorus that set fire to everything the fragments touched. The converted A-20s were tested in combat on September 12, 1942, in a raid against the Japanese airfield at Buna in New Guinea. The results exceeded every expectation. Flying at wave-top height and treetop level, the strafers roared in before defenders could react, suppressing anti-aircraft fire with streams of 50-caliber armor-piercing rounds, then releasing their parafrag bombs directly over the target. Japanese fighters caught on the ground exploded, fuel dumps detonated, buildings disintegrated. The lightly constructed Japanese aircraft, built for agility and range, not armor, tore apart under the half-inch bullets traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The strafers pulled up and away, leaving behind a trail of destruction that looked like the wrath of an angry god. General Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to do the same thing to the B-25 Mitchell. This was a bigger challenge. The A-20 was a light bomber, relatively small, relatively easy to modify. The B-25 was a medium bomber, larger, more complex, with different aerodynamics and structural considerations. Adding weight to the nose of an aircraft affects its center of gravity, which affects its stability and handling. Installing guns creates recoil forces that must be absorbed by the airframe. Modifying a bomber designed for high-altitude level flight to perform low-level strafing runs meant accepting risks that no engineer at North American Aviation would have approved. But Pappy Gunn didn't work for North American Aviation. He worked for General Kenny, and General Kenny didn't care about what the manual said was possible. He cared about what needed to be done. Gunn was assisted by Jack Fox, a North American Aviation technical representative based at Charters Towers. Fox sent drawings of Gunn's proposed modifications back to the factory in Long Beach, California, but there were too few B-25s in the theater to spare any for modification experiments yet. The first B-25s were needed for conventional bombing missions. Gunn would have to wait for more aircraft to arrive before he could begin the conversions that would define the rest of the Pacific Air War. The waiting was agony. Every day meant more supply runs, more reinforcements, more American soldiers dying on jungle battlefields, more time his family spent in that internment camp. Gunn flew combat missions himself, testing his A-20 conversions, refining the tactics, and proving the concept. He flew more missions than almost any other man in theater, accumulating combat hours and enemy kills, earning 2 distinguished flying crosses, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and eventually 9 Purple Hearts, 9 separate wounds. 9 times he bled in combat and kept flying. By late 1942, B-25 Mitchells were arriving in Australia in greater numbers. General Kenny authorized Gunn to begin the conversion program. Working with a small team of mechanics, Gunn established a B-25 conversion center at Townsville. The modifications were extensive. Remove the transparent bombardier's nose, replace it with solid metal panels, install 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in the nose, 4 in underwing blisters or fuselage packages. Some aircraft received additional guns, 2 more forward-firing guns in cheek blisters on either side of the nose, bringing the total forward-firing armament to 10 or even 12 heavy machine guns. Add the dorsal turret's 2 guns, which could be synchronized to fire forward with the fixed guns, and some B-25s could bring 14 50-caliber machine guns to bear on a target simultaneously. 14 50-caliber machine guns, each gun fires 850 rounds per minute. Each round is a half-inch diameter armor-piercing projectile traveling at 2,900 feet per second. 14 guns equaled 11,900 rounds per minute, nearly 200 rounds per second, creating a cone of destruction so dense that anything caught within it simply disintegrated. The conversions took time, weeks, not overnight, not a single desperate night of improvisation, but a sustained program of modification and testing. Each aircraft had to be carefully modified to maintain structural integrity. The guns had to be aligned, tested, adjusted. Ammunition feed systems had to be installed and debugged. Pilots had to learn new tactics for an aircraft that now handled differently, weighed more in the nose, and required different flying techniques to compensate for the weight of all those guns and all that ammunition. But the results, when they came, were devastating. The first squadron of Stryker B-25s was ready for combat in early 1943. They would prove their worth in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, one of the most one-sided victories in the history of naval aviation, a battle that would demonstrate beyond any doubt that Pappy Gunn's jury-rigged gunships had changed the Pacific War forever. In the first days of March 1943, intelligence reports reached General Kenny's headquarters in Port Moresby, New Guinea. A Japanese convoy was assembling at Rabaul, 8 transport ships carrying nearly 7,000 troops, escorted by 8 destroyers. Destination: Lae, New Guinea, where Japanese forces were under pressure from Allied advances. The convoy represented a massive reinforcement effort, enough troops to turn the tide of the ground campaign, and enough supplies to sustain Japanese resistance for months. General Kenny knew what he had to do. The convoy had to be destroyed, not damaged, not delayed, destroyed. Every ship, every soldier, every ton of supplies. If those 7,000 troops reached Lagos, American and Australian soldiers would pay for it in blood on jungle battlefields where the enemy already held every advantage terrain could provide. Kenny had the aircraft to do it. He had B-17 flying fortresses for high-altitude bombing. He had B-25 Mitchells, both conventional bombers and Pappy Gunn strafer conversions. He had A-20 Havocs, similarly modified. He had P-38 Lightning fighters for escort and strafing. And he had a new tactic that had been tested in smaller engagements, but never against a target this large, this well-defended, this important: skip bombing. The concept was simple in theory, terrifying in execution. A bomber approached its target at extremely low altitude, 200 feet or less, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the waves. At point-blank range, perhaps a quarter mile from the target, the bomber released its bombs with a slight upward trajectory. The bombs skipped across the water like flat stones thrown by children at a pond, except these stones weighed 500 pounds and contained high explosives. They skipped once, twice, then slammed into the ship's hull at or below the waterline, exactly where naval architects know a ship is most vulnerable. The explosion opened the hull to the sea, the ship flooded, the ship sank. But skip bombing required pilots to fly directly at heavily armed warships through walls of anti-aircraft fire, low enough that a single mistake meant hitting the water and disintegrating, slow enough that enemy gunners had time to aim, close enough that if the bomb detonated prematurely, the attacking aircraft got caught in its own blast. It required nerves of steel and perfect timing. It required aircraft that could suppress the anti-aircraft fire long enough for the bomber to release its ordnance and escape. It required Pappy Gunn's strafer B-25s. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea began on March 2, 1943. The Japanese convoy departed Rabaul, steaming southwest through the Solomon Sea toward the Huon Gulf and Lae. Australian reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy and shadowed it, reporting position and course. General Kenny mobilized his air groups. Bombers and fighters took off from bases throughout New Guinea and northern Australia. The weather was terrible. Heavy clouds, rain squalls, poor visibility. But the weather worked in the Allies' favor, allowing aircraft to approach unseen until the last moment. The first attacks were conventional. B-17 flying fortresses bombed from altitude on March 2nd and 3rd, scoring few hits, but forcing the convoy to maneuver constantly, slowing its progress. Then the weather cleared on the morning of March 3rd, and Kenny unleashed the strafers. The modified B-25s and A-20s came in low, so low that their propellers were churning spray from the wave tops. They approached in formation, a wall of aircraft bearing down on the convoy at 200 Mamatsampri. The Japanese ships saw them coming. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. 20mm and 25mm cannons threw up walls of explosive shells. Heavier 40mm guns pumped rounds in arcing trajectories. The sky filled with tracer fire, with black puffs of exploding shells, with the smoke and fury of desperate defense. And then the strafers opened fire. 14 50 caliber machine guns per aircraft, multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously, thousands of rounds per second hammering into Japanese ships. The effect was apocalyptic. Anti-aircraft gun crews were scythed down where they stood. Gun shields were perforated like paper. Bridge windows shattered. Superstructures were shredded. The armor-piercing rounds punched through light armor, ricocheted off steel bulkheads, tore through wooden structures, set fires, detonated ammunition. The Japanese gunners who survived the initial onslaught found themselves suppressed, unable to aim, unable to fire, forced to take cover as half-inch bullets tore apart everything around them. In that window of suppressed fire, the skip-bombing B-25s and conventional Mitchells released their loads. 500-pound bombs skipped across the water. Some missed. War is never perfect, but many hit. They slammed into hulls below the waterline. They exploded with the force of half a ton of high explosive, concentrated against the weakest part of the ship's structure. Steel plates buckled. Welds failed. The sea poured in. The transport ships, heavily laden with troops and supplies, were particularly vulnerable. They weren't warships. They didn't have armored hulls or sophisticated damage control. When the bombs hit, when the hulls opened to the Pacific, they began sinking immediately. Troops below decks, trapped in compartments that were flooding, had nowhere to go. The ships settled lower in the water, listed to one side, then capsized or broke apart and slid beneath the waves. The destroyers fared better, warships designed to take punishment, but even they could not withstand the coordinated assault. One destroyer took a bomb amidships and broke in half. Another was so riddled with .50 caliber fire that it became unmanageable, drifting in circles as fires raged unchecked. A third destroyer, trying to rescue survivors from a sinking transport, was caught by strafers and turned into a funeral pyre. The battle continued for 3 days. Every time the Japanese tried to rescue survivors, Allied aircraft appeared. Every time a damaged ship tried to limp away, it was attacked again. The strafer B-25s hunted like wolves, working in coordination with conventional bombers, with fighters, with reconnaissance aircraft spotting targets. They used the new parachute fragmentation bombs, floating them down over the decks of destroyers, killing exposed personnel, starting fires, creating chaos. They strafed lifeboats and debris fields, not out of cruelty, but because those survivors were soldiers who, if rescued, would fight again on New Guinea's battlefields. By March 4th, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over. The results were staggering. All 8 transport ships sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, 3 others heavily damaged. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in the sinking ships or in the water. Fewer than 1,000 reached land, and most of those were immediately captured or killed by Allied forces. The reinforcement effort was annihilated. The supplies that were supposed to sustain the Japanese garrison at Lae for months were at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Allied losses: 4 aircraft shot down, 13 aircrew killed or missing. It was one of the most one-sided victories in the history of warfare. And at the center of it, making it possible, were Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s, the strafers that suppressed defensive fire, that allowed the skip bombers to approach, that tore Japanese ships apart with concentrated machine gun fire. General Kenny immediately ordered more conversions. Word spread throughout the theater. Other air forces wanted the strafers. The 13th Air Force sent B-25s to Brisbane for conversion. Depot engineers at Tonotua began modifying aircraft. The 10th Air Force in India picked up the modifications. What began as one man's desperate improvisation in a tin hangar in Queensland became standard practice across the Pacific. But the story doesn't end with tactical success, because North American aviation back in California had been watching. The factory representatives had been sending reports about Gunn's modifications. Engineers in Long Beach had been studying the results, and they began incorporating Gunn's innovations into new production models. In late 1943, North American introduced the B-25G model. The transparent nose was gone, replaced by a solid metal nose housing a 75mm M4 cannon, a tank gun mounted in an aircraft, firing 3-pound high-explosive shells that could engage ships from 2 miles away and sink smaller vessels with a single hit. 450 caliber machine guns supplemented the cannon. The concept was innovative. The execution was problematic. The 75mm cannon produced tremendous recoil. Each time it fired, the entire aircraft shuddered. Pilots struggled to keep the aircraft stable. The cannon was manually loaded, slow to reload, and quickly exhausted its limited ammunition supply. After 7 weeks of combat, Units equipped with the B-25G had expended all their 75mm ammunition. The cannon-armed Mitchells were an interesting experiment, but ultimately they proved less effective than Pappy Gunn's simpler solution: more machine guns. The B-25H model appeared next, 1,000 aircraft built with even more machine guns. The 75mm cannon was replaced with a lighter, 14-gun version, 8 in the nose, 4 in side blisters, 2 in the dorsal turret. Some H models also carried rockets, 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets that could be ripple-fired in devastating salvos. But the ultimate expression of Pappy Gunn's vision was the B-25J, introduced in 1944. North American built over 4,000 J models. Many were delivered with transparent noses for conventional bombing, but the air depot system created conversion kits, the strafer nose option. When a J model was converted to a strafer, it carried 18 50 caliber machine guns, 8 in the nose, 4 in the fuselage packages, 2 in the dorsal turret, 1 in each waist position, and 2 in the tail. 14 of those 18 guns fired directly forward. 18 50 caliber machine guns on a single aircraft meant 50,300 rounds per minute combined rate of fire, over 250 rounds per second. A B-25J strafer, firing all forward guns simultaneously, put more lead into the air than an entire infantry company could fire with their rifles. The effect on targets was not destruction, it was disintegration. These heavily armed Mitchells continued to devastate Japanese targets throughout New Guinea, the Philippines, and Okinawa until the end of the war. They strafed airfields, destroying parked aircraft. They attacked bridges, severing supply lines. They hunted coastal barges and small vessels. They supported ground troops with devastating close air support. They were so effective that captured enemy documents warned Japanese forces not to attack when the strafers were overhead. Weapons are useless against them, and attacking will only infuriate the monsters. The strafer crews developed their own tactics and their own reputation. They flew low enough to see the expressions on enemy soldiers' faces. They approached from unexpected angles, over mountains, up valleys, along coastlines, using terrain to mask their approach until the last second. They worked in coordination with each other, one aircraft suppressing fire while another delivered the killing blow. They were feared, they were hated, they were merciless. And behind every one of those aircraft was Pappy Gunn's desperate fury, channeled into engineering, transformed into lethality. Major Gunn, promoted for his innovations and his combat record, was eventually sent back to the United States to oversee factory production of the new B-25 variants at North American Aviation. It was a recognition of his contributions, an acknowledgement that his field modifications had been so successful they needed to be incorporated into production aircraft. But Gunn didn't want recognition. He wanted to be in the Pacific, fighting, killing Japanese, shortening the war that held his family hostage. He returned to the Pacific as soon as he could. He continued flying combat missions. He continued taking risks that made his commanders nervous. In late 1944, a Japanese bombing attack on Leyte in the Philippines caught him on the ground. He was wounded, his 9th Purple Heart, badly enough that he was removed from active combat. The war continued without him, but by then, the strafer program he pioneered was so thoroughly integrated into Pacific air operations that it no longer needed him. In February 1945, American forces liberated Manila. They fought house to house, building to building, against fanatical Japanese defenders who would rather die than surrender. On February 3rd, American troops reached the University of Stu, Thomas. They found over 3,000 internees, starving, sick, traumatized by 3 years of captivity. Among them were Clara Louise Gunn and her 4 children. Pappy Gunn was reunited with his family. They were alive, barely, malnourished, traumatized, forever marked by their ordeal, but alive. The war he fought to shorten, the modifications he made, the missions he flew, the Japanese he killed, all of it was for this moment. His family survived. The Philippines were liberated. The war ground toward its conclusion. Gunn retired from the Army Air Forces as a full colonel on June 30th, 1948, medically retired due to his accumulated wounds. He returned to the Philippines to rebuild Philippine Airlines. the airline he helped start before the war. The company expanded, provided flights across the South Pacific, and became one of the region's major carriers. Gunn flew again, not in combat, but in commerce, carrying passengers and cargo instead of guns and fury. On October 11, 1957, Colonel Paul Irvin "Pappy" Gunn died when his chartered Beech-18 crashed in a storm over the Philippines. He was 57 years old. He survived 21 years in the Navy, 5 years of brutal combat in the Pacific War, 9 combat wounds, countless close calls, and the loss of nearly everything he cared about during the dark years when his family was imprisoned. A storm over the islands he loved finally claimed him, but his legacy endures. The strafer concept he pioneered didn't die with him. During the Korean War, modified B-25s provided close air support using the same tactics Gunn developed. The principle, heavy forward-firing armament on a stable platform, became doctrine. In the 1960s, when the United States began developing gunships for Vietnam, the engineers looked back at Pappy Gunn's work. They studied his modifications. They understood his insight, that sometimes the best weapon isn't the newest or the most technologically advanced, but the one that puts the most firepower exactly where it needs to be. The AC-47 Spooky, the first modern gunship, used sideways firing guns and a pylon turn, a different approach than Gunn's forward-firing strafers, but the same understanding that transport and bomber aircraft can be converted into devastating gunships. The AC-130 Spectre, still flying today with 105mm howitzers and sophisticated targeting systems, is a direct descendant of Gunn's vision. Take an aircraft designed for one purpose, modify it for another, and create a weapon so effective it changes how wars are fought. Every Air Force close air support doctrine written since the 1940s acknowledges, implicitly or explicitly, that Pappy Gunn was right, that desperation can produce innovation, that field modifications can outpace factory design, that the side willing to improvise, to break rules, to transform its tools into weapons its enemies have never seen, holds an advantage that technology alone cannot provide. The irony is profound and multi-layered. A bomber designed to drop ordnance from altitude becomes a low-level strafer. A former Navy pilot, retired and running a civilian airline, becomes one of the most innovative weapons designers of the war. An aircraft modification program, born from desperation and scavenged parts, became the foundation for gunship doctrine used for 80 years. A man fighting to save his family helps destroy an empire. And perhaps the deepest irony, the B-25 Mitchell, which Pappy Gunn modified so dramatically, was never supposed to be a close air support aircraft. It was supposed to deliver bombs from medium altitude. It was supposed to be safe, orthodox, and conventional. But orthodoxy doesn't win wars. Innovation does. Desperation does. Fury channeled into engineering. The morning of September 12, 1942, Pappy Gunn's modified A-20 attacked Buna. The raid succeeded beyond all expectations. But Gunn wasn't celebrating. He was already planning the next modification, the next improvement, the next innovation, because every day the war continued was another day his family spent in that camp. Every sortie his aircraft flew, every enemy position his modifications destroyed, brought the end closer. War is often portrayed as a story of grand strategy, of decisive battles, of great commanders moving armies like pieces on a chessboard. But wars are also won in tin hangars in the Australian heat, by middle-aged former sailors with grease under their fingernails and fury in their hearts, by men who understand that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat is simply being willing to look at an aircraft, a perfectly good conventional orthodox aircraft-y, and ask, what if we added more guns? Pappy Gunn asked that question. He answered it with a wrench and a welding torch. And the Japanese Empire paid the price in blood and steel at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The B-25 Mitchell flew in every theater of the Second World War. It participated in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. It bombed targets across Europe, Africa, and Asia. It served with distinction in dozens of air forces around the world. Nearly 10,000 were built. It was reliable. It was versatile. It was loved by its crews. But in the Southwest Pacific, the Mitchell was something more. It was a gunship. It was a ship killer. It was a terror weapon that forced the Japanese to abandon daylight supply runs, to scatter their convoys, to accept that American air power could reach them anywhere, anytime, and turn their ships into funeral pyres. And all of it, the tactics, the modifications, the victories, traces back to one man who refused to accept that his family's imprisonment was inevitable, who refused to accept that the war would last as long as orthodox thinking suggested, who refused to accept that aircraft had to be used the way their designers intended. Paul Irvin, Pappy Gunn, didn't invent the gunship overnight in a moment of desperate improvisation. He developed it over months of trial and error, testing and refinement, combat experience and engineering insight. But he did it faster than any official program could have. He did it with salvaged parts and improvised solutions. He did it because he had to, because every delay meant his family suffered, because fury is a powerful engineer when channeled through skill and determination. The Strafer B-25s weren't perfect. They were nose-heavy. They handled differently than conventional Mitchells. The recoil from firing all those guns simultaneously was violent enough to slow the aircraft noticeably. Ammunition consumption was enormous. A Strafer could expend its entire load in seconds of sustained fire. The aircraft were vulnerable to ground fire because they flew so low, crews died. Aircraft were lost. War is never clean, never easy, never without cost, but the Strafers worked. They changed the Pacific War. They allowed American forces to interdict Japanese supply lines, to support ground troops with devastating precision, and to destroy enemy installations before defenders could respond. They saved lives, American, Australian, and Allied lives, by shortening battles, by preventing reinforcements from reaching embattled garrisons, by giving ground forces the air support they desperately needed. And every time a Strafer B-25 dove toward a Japanese ship or airfield, every time those 14 machine guns opened fire and the target disintegrated under concentrated fire, it was Pappy Gunn's fury made manifest. It was a father's desperation transformed into engineering. It was improvisation defeating orthodoxy. It was proof that sometimes the best solutions come not from careful planning, but from having no other choice. The Pacific War ended on August 15th, 1945, with Japan's surrender. Pappy Gunn's family was free. The Strafer B-25s had helped bring that moment closer. How much closer? Impossible to calculate. But every ship sunk, every airfield destroyed, every battle shortened, contributed to the cumulative pressure that forced Japan to accept the unacceptable. Wars are won by many factors: strategy, logistics, industrial production, courage, sacrifice. But they're also won by individuals who see problems and solve them, who refuse to accept limitations, who transform ordinary tools into extraordinary weapons. Pappy Gunn was that kind of man. His contribution to victory wasn't a single decisive battle, one dramatic moment that turned the tide of war. It was hundreds of modifications, each one meticulously tested and refined. Thousands of sorties flown by crews who trusted his work with their lives. Tens of thousands of enemy casualties inflicted by aircraft he transformed with his own hands, working through exhaustion and grief. The B-25 Mitchell bomber was a good aircraft when it came off the production line. Reliable, capable, well-designed for its intended role. Pappy Gunn made it exceptional, not through sophisticated engineering calculations or advanced technology, but by asking a simple, brutally practical question. What does this aircraft need to do the job that needs doing right now, in this war, against this enemy? The answer was more guns, more forward-firing heavy machine guns, capable of suppressing enemy fire before it could reach the bomber, capable of shredding aircraft on the ground, destroying supply depots and turning cargo vessels into floating coffins with overwhelming, concentrated firepower. So he added more guns, with wrenches and welding torches working in sweltering heat, with salvaged parts scavenged from wrecked aircraft and improvised mounts fashioned from whatever materials he could find, with ingenuity born of desperation and refined through brutal combat experience, with the fury of a father who knew his wife and children were somewhere out there, trapped behind enemy lines, suffering in ways he could barely allow himself to imagine, and the result changed the war. 80 years later, the United States Air Force still operates gunships, based on the fundamental principles Pappy Gunn pioneered in those desperate early days of the Pacific War. The platforms are different. Massive turboprop transports like the AC-130 instead of medium piston-engine bombers. The weapons are far more sophisticated. Rotary cannons that can fire thousands of rounds per minute, 105mm howitzers, precision-guided munitions that can strike within feet of friendly forces. The targeting systems use synthetic aperture radar, infrared sensors, and computers processing more data in a second than Gunn's entire workshop could have stored in a year. Technology that would have seemed like pure magic to his generation, but the fundamental insight remains unchanged. A transport or bomber aircraft, properly modified and crewed by specialists who understand their role, can deliver sustained, devastating firepower against ground targets with a precision and intensity that other platforms simply cannot match. It can loiter over the battlefield for hours, providing continuous fire support. It can engage multiple targets in rapid succession. It can operate at night, in weather that grounds other aircraft, providing a psychological impact on enemy forces that goes beyond the mere physical destruction it inflicts. Every AC-130 gunship pilot who has ever pressed the trigger owes something to Pappy Gunn. Every close air support controller calling in fire from circling gunships, knowing that help is overhead and ready, is using tactics refined in the skies over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea. Every innovation in aerial gunnery, every advancement in close air support doctrine stands on foundations Gunn laid in a tin hangar in Queensland, working with hand tools, salvaged parts, and an all-consuming fury to strike back at an enemy that had taken everything from him. This is not the story of advanced technology defeating primitive enemy equipment. This is not a tale of American industrial might overwhelming a backward foe. The Japanese were not unsophisticated. Their aircraft were excellent. The Zero fighter was superior to most Allied fighters early in the war. Their ships were well armed and well crewed, designed by engineers who understood naval warfare as well as anyone in the world. Their pilots were skilled, experienced from years of combat in China, and possessed a courage that bordered on fanaticism. They understood combined arms warfare, naval aviation, and jungle fighting. They had proven themselves against European colonial forces and caught the American Pacific Fleet off guard at Pearl Harbor. But they didn't have Pappy Gunn. They didn't have the blacksmith's son from Arkansas, who knew aircraft intimately enough to understand not just how they worked, but how they could work with the right modifications. Who was desperate enough to try unconventional solutions that factory engineers would have dismissed as impractical or dangerous? Who was furious enough to work 18-hour days modifying bombers in tropical heat, pushing through exhaustion and illness? Because every hour of delay was another hour his family spent in captivity. Another day his wife and children endured privation and fear in a prison camp. Another sunset that might be their last. That personal stake, that burning motivation, drove innovations that desperation alone might not have achieved. The Japanese fought bravely. They fought with skill honed through years of combat. They fought with everything they had, often to the last man, refusing to surrender even when defeat was inevitable. But they couldn't adapt as fast as Gunn could innovate. They couldn't develop counter-tactics to strategies they'd never encountered before. Tactics that violated every conventional doctrine of bomber operations. They couldn't shoot down aircraft that came in too low and too fast. That didn't behave like bombers were supposed to behave. And when those modified B-25s came screaming in at wave-top height, so low the spray kicked up by their propellers left salt trails on the wings. With 850 caliber machine guns blazing from the nose, skip bombs releasing to bounce across the water toward their hulls like stones skipped by some vengeful god. All the courage and skill in the world couldn't save them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns like this, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story of the extraordinary individuals who shaped history.